Welcome to the second session of the workshop today. Jan-Philipp Dapprich will give a presentation on his paper, Tokens Make the World Go Round. He recently finished his dissertation on computer socialism, working with Paul Cockshott at Glasgow University, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong there. I'm looking forward to the presentation and a comment by Peter Fleissner. Just to point out, with regard to questions, please again post them in the chat to the questions collectors. As part of the moderation, I will first take questions from women, and I encourage them to ask questions because the field is, and also this workshop today is quite male dominated, and we would like to counteract that. Jan-Philipp Dapprich, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hold on. There we go. All right. So for my doctoral thesis, I devised a computer simulation of a socialist economy, and I have to say that my approach is perhaps a bit more in the central planning direction, which was criticized in the first talk. Although I can certainly see a lot of things that I talk about reflected in this commons model as well. But I will not present today my simulation as a whole. Instead, I want to talk in particular about the socialist idea of labor tokens, or in my model, they are sort of detached from labor in a sense. And this relates to just a part of my model, namely the distribution of consumer goods, how consumer goods are distributed. And what I try to do in my model is link optimal planning of production to consumption behavior. So you get feedback from consumers, which then affects the planning of production as a whole, right? And maybe at the end, I'll briefly sort of make a comment also about how what I'm going to talk about today then fits into my larger model. All right. So my talk will have three parts. First of all, I will introduce what socialist labor tokens are and what they have and don't have in common with money. Then I'll talk about the needs principle, Marx's famous principle, from each according to his or her abilities to each according to his or her needs, which Marx thinks is realized in a higher stage of communism, which no longer uses these labor tokens. So the labor tokens just belong to a lower stage. And I'll argue that his case for abolishing the lower stage and the tokens in favor of a higher stage is bogus and doesn't work. And we should just stick to the lower stage, which does make use of these tokens. And then third, I will detach these tokens from labor by arguing that the token prices, so the rate at which these tokens can be redeemed for consumer products, should not be linked to labor time. Okay, so first of all, Marx of course assumes a communist society here. This means that the means of production are collectively owned and administered. So you have a sort of general planning of production, not just in individual firms or enterprises, but in society as a whole. And according to Engels, this has to be based on the available means, right? So which productive resources, machinery, labor, and so on is available. It also has to be based on the labor burden. So this is different from the available labor. This is sort of the burden which the labor process is for workers, which is of course something bad, which is to be avoided. And at the same time, it has to be based on the achievable use value. So production is based on creating something of use for society, which satisfies some need. And obviously you're trying to, in some sense, maximize that. Marx then compares this to a Robinson Crusoe society. He says that Robinson Crusoe, living alone on this island, is directly compelled by necessity, which is something we talked about, the last talk mentioned also, directly compelled by necessity to proportion his time to various uses, whether he's going to hunt or fish or farm, is going to be based on directly on necessity. The difference now is that this is being done in a communist society in a social manner. So society as a whole has to apportion its resources, including labor time, to various uses based on necessity, and it's not based on on just one individual Robinson Crusoe. There is, in such a communist society, no question of the distribution of the means of production. And that is because the means of production, of course, are collectively owned and remain collectively owned. So there's no question of who is going to own which machinery and factories and so on. There's, however, a question of the distribution of consumer goods. So this socialized production will lead to a social supply of goods, which somehow has to be distributed to individual users, who in the end are going to be wearing the jackets, the clothes that have been produced, are going to be eating apples and oranges and so on. Right? So the question is, who gets these goods? Who gets which goods and how many? And at least in the lower stage of communism, for Marx, the answer is labor tokens. So what are these labor tokens? Well, each worker receives labor tokens corresponding to their labor time that they have contributed to socialized production. But Marx argues, and this is quite crucial, he criticizes here in the Critique of the Gotha program, a proposal by a social democratic party at his time. He says there have to be significant deductions from this. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the second part. These tokens are then denominated in hours or minutes of time worked, right? So the unit of a count here really is time. The token might say 1 hour of labor contributed, 10 minutes of labor contributed, something like this. And the tokens can then be redeemed for products which take an equivalent amount of time to produce. So a computer might take a lot of time to produce, maybe 100 hours. So you'd need to redeem tokens representing 100 hours of labor time to get a computer, while an apple can perhaps be mass produced so that each apple will only take maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So it would have lesser token price. And this yields to this principle that in a sense, the amount of labor which he or she the worker has given to society in one form, she receives back in another. And that's the general idea here. But keep in mind, again, there are these deductions made. And you might ask, well, aren't these tokens just money? And Marx says no. Says these vouchers, labor vouchers or labor tokens, are not money. They do not circulate. So they are not used in exchange and do not facilitate the circulation of commodities in a private economy. There is no private economy under communism where these vouchers could be exchanged to facilitate payment between private actors. And they just don't change hands from one private user to another private user. And instead of being exchanged in between sort of the individual and sort of collective production, collective society as a whole, they are simply deleted upon use. So think more of the theater ticket, not giving the theater ticket back to the theater, and the theater can then use the theater ticket to pay its actors or pay rent for the theater or anything like that, right? The theater has no need for the ticket. It doesn't need it. So the ticket is just ripped apart, invalidated when you enter to see a show. And if you do not decide to do that, if you do not decide to use your ticket, right, you paid for the ticket, but you're not going to see the show, the theater is not going to be upset that they don't receive their ticket back. The theater doesn't mind this, right? So it's not really that the theater receives something back. So this is not an exchange relationship. Instead, the ticket is simply invalidated. I nonetheless think there are significant parallels to modern fiat money, certainly as described by neo-Chartalism, so the state theory of money, which is now incorporated most well known in modern monetary theory. So according to this account of money, of modern fiat money at least, the state creates money at will by spending it into the economy. Right? So a central bank, a state government institution, issues money, can issue as much as as needs be or as it wants. And so the state simply spends this money, pays state employees, pays state contractors, and so on, and thereby spends this into the economy. And the state then deletes money when it taxes it out of the economy again. Right. So there are two fiscal operations: creating money by keystroke, simply entering a number in a computer at the central bank, and then deleting it again when it is taxed out of the economy. Why is this money valued? Well, because it is needed to pay taxes, right? But crucially, it's spent into the economy first, but because it is needed to pay taxes, private companies, private individuals are willing to accept this because at some point, someone will need this money to pay taxes. So it is generally accepted as payment because of that. So money can then be seen as a government-issued IOU, so an instrument of debt, that is accepted as tax payment. So the promise is by the government that it will accept these IOUs when it issues them, it will at some point accept them as tax payment. But these IOUs then circulate in the private economy, so they're not immediately used by whoever they are issued to. If you're issued an IOU by the government because you're a state employee, for example, you can then go to a supermarket, which is another private entity, and give the IOU to them. And the supermarket might pay the taxes, right? So the person who's issued the IOUs is not necessarily the one who will later pay taxes. So I then suggest that these tokens are simply non-circulating IOUs. They are not needed to pay for taxes, but they are needed to receive consumer products out of the social supply of goods. So you need to redeem these IOUs, these tokens, in order to receive a share of the social product. But unlike fiat money, they do not circulate because they are simply issued to workers or to other consumers and then used by them to receive something out of social supply of goods. Because production is socialized, there's no need or there's no use in giving them to someone else, because you can't receive anything from them. You can just as easily receive directly out of social production. So tokens are then non-circulating IOUs, which are redeemable for consumer products. Okay, now over to the second part of my talk, the needs principle. And as I said, Marx has this idea of two stages of communism, and the needs principle and the lower stage of communism, which is based on these labor tokens, will eventually have to be abolished in favor of a higher stage of communism. And the higher stage does not appear to involve these labor tokens at all. Instead, it directly realizes the needs principle. And the needs principle is from each according to his or her abilities to each according to his or her needs. So there are two parts to this. First of all, each contributes labor according to her abilities to perform labor. And then each receives goods directly in accordance with her need. Why does Marx think we have to move over to this higher stage of communism? Well, in the lower stage, each receives an equal amount of tokens for equal work. So in some sense, you have equality here. But Marx has egalitarian concerns, but he seems to be concerned about the equality of outcomes, not about the quality of sort of the process or the standards being applied. And he says that he seems to suggest that applying equal standards to unequal people who have different abilities and different needs will in the end result in an unequal outcome. Of course, people do differ in terms of their ability to perform labor, think perhaps of a disability. They also differ in terms of their needs. One example that Marx gives here is that some people might have more or less children, and if they are given sort of the same amount of tokens for the same amount of labor performed, some will still end up being poorer because they have more mouths to feed with the same tokens. Right? Or we could also perhaps think of needs for health treatment, which might be different depending on our health condition, right? Whether we're sick or not. He says then in the end, this equal standard, which is being applied in the lower stage, is still bourgeois right. Under capitalism too, you have this principle of equal exchange, though somewhat differently than in the lower stage of communism. But the lower stage is still sort of reminiscent of this capitalist principle, and should thus in the end, in the higher stage, be abolished. So there's a very influential interpretation of this by Lenin, which I think is even more influential now than sort of the original conception by Marx, which I think is a complete misinterpretation. And I'll briefly discuss this. So Lenin understood the needs principle to imply that each will take freely, can take whatever you want according to his or her needs. So anyone can take whatever they want. Lenin says any quantity of truffles, cars, pianos, and so on. This seems to me to be very different from distribution according to needs, because distribution according to needs says that everyone will receive what they need, not what they will take freely. So there's a clear limit on what people can take. You can't take more than what you need. Okay. Then it also says that there will be no control whatsoever over one's labor. So anyone can take whatever they want without any control over their labor. But again, according to the needs principle, each has to contribute according to her abilities. So there does seem to be control about what every person contributes. And it's not this sort of ad libitum principle which Lenin suggests. So I think this is a clear misinterpretation. Even with Marx's with Marx's conception of the higher stage, I have my problems, and I argue against this. I think that a distinct higher stage of communism is not necessarily to realize the needs principle. So my problem is not with the needs principle. I basically agree with that. But I think there's no distinct higher stage needed to achieve that, and it can be achieved within the lower stage. Because Marx's lower stage of communism already allows for differential needs and abilities to be taken into account through what he calls common funds. So remember that Marx thinks that there have to be deductions made from the tokens paid out to workers. So workers do not in the end receive the undiminished proceeds of their labor. But deductions have to be made for loads of purposes that Marx mentions. Some of the more important ones, I think, are the expansion of production. So some products might not be immediately consumed by consumer, but go towards sort of new machinery, new factories, which will enable more production in the future. You might also have common satisfaction of needs. Marx explicitly mentions healthcare and schools here, which would be resourced through these common funds. And he also explicitly mentions funds for those unable to work. He already mentions that in the lower stage. Yeah. These funds already seem to provide, at least for some differentially occurred needs, healthcare, provision for children, right? In terms of schools, at least. And of course, abilities are also taken into account because there are funds for those unable to work. So it seems then that Marx doesn't provide a good reason for abandoning the token system of the lower stage. Through these common funds, we can already take into account differences in needs and abilities. And perhaps we should extend this even a bit further than what Marx discusses. Perhaps there should be child benefits for people who have more children, right? Or perhaps we should not just have funds for those completely unable to work, but maybe also some funds for those who can perhaps work a bit, but not as much as others, right? So this could all be taken into account through these common funds. There are, however, I claim, two advantages of these tokens. They are allowed to divide the social product into equal shares or any other pattern of shares, right? So by giving out these tokens, we can say, well, you get 10 tokens, you get 12 tokens perhaps. And this then allows us to divide the social product according to a certain pattern, which we deem sensible. And at the same time, each consumer has a free choice about the composition of their share, because they can freely choose how to use their tokens, how to redeem them for a part of the social, for which part of the social product, which kinds of products. Okay, I'll finally talk about token pricing. So under Marx's proposal and loads of other socialist proposals even before him, the prices of consumer goods, the token prices, I still think they're not money, they're tokens, but there's still sort of a rate at which you have to redeem them, and this is given by labor time. So the labor time necessary to produce these products, embodied in these products in some way. I think this can lead to several related problems. The first one is the distribution will not be Pareto optimal. This is sort of the line of argument that the neoclassical economists might take. I'm not going to go into this too much. Instead, I will focus on the second and third point. So the second point is that token prices, if they are fixed at labor time, I don't think they accurately reflect cost. And by this, I mean decision relevant opportunity cost. And the third point is I think this will lead to shortages or waste. So instead, I suggest that the token prices should correspond to the clearing rate at which supply and demand are balanced. So first, opportunity cost. So opportunity cost can be understood as the opportunities which are lost if we do X, right? So the opportunity cost of X is what opportunities will be lost if we do X. When a consumer receives an apple out of the social supply of good, the opportunity cost of that is that the apple can no longer be enjoyed by others. That's the lost opportunity. It's in a sense use value that is being lost, right? Labor time is not decision relevant opportunity cost. It's not decision relevant at the point of distribution where things are being distributed out of the social supply of goods. It's no longer decision relevant. Because we cannot simply go back in time to the point of where production was sort of planned and started and tell plantation workers, you know, that you should plant orange trees instead of apple trees or something like this. That's no longer possible. We've already produced oranges or apples, right? So labor time is not a decision relevant opportunity cost at the point of distribution. It might still be relevant when we plan production, right? At that point, we will have to take into account labor time and all kinds of other things which are involved in production, right? But not at the point of distribution. Clearing prices, on the other hand, are responsive to consumer demand. So I then claim that this means they are more reflective of the importance that consumer places on various goods. And that is still decision relevant. Because when we receive an apple out of the social supply of good, that is use value which can no longer be used by others. And so we have to take into account the importance that this apple might have to others. And then the third point, shortages and waste. So with fixed prices, supply and demand will not necessarily balance. That means there might be more or less supply of a certain product type than the demand for that product type. And if there's more supply, well, what will happen with the surplus? And it seems like that surplus will have to go to waste. You could, of course, say, well, we're going to give away the surplus at a lower price or even for free, right? But then you no longer use labor pricing. You do adapt the price to demand, which is precisely what I'm suggesting, right? If there's less supply, so if there are less items of a type, then consumers willing to use their tokens to get that item at that price. Well, then who decides who gets these limited items? So you could, for example, have a principle first come, first serve, right? So whoever first shows up at the distribution centers get these items for the token price. Whoever shows up late doesn't get any of them, right? But whatever principle of rationing you then employ, it means that the tokens will no longer be decisive for who gets these items. So the tokens, in a sense, would lose their purpose. But with clearing prices, you avoid this problem because they precisely balance supply and demand. So there will be precisely as many people demanding these items as there are available. And an interesting consequence of clearing prices that I might also mention is for digital products, which can simply be copied at will, like music, digital films, computer games, software, all these things, right? For them, the clearing price is simply zero, or at least close to zero, because the supply is infinite in a sense, right? So an implication of this is that all digital products would basically be available for free. So to summarize, tokens are non-circulating IOUs that can be redeemed for consumer products. Needs principle can be sufficiently realized within a token system, I claim, through these common funds. So there's no need for a distinct higher stage of communism, which doesn't have tokens. And the token prices should correspond to clearing prices rather than labor time. All right, thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much also from my side. Peter Fleissner, would you like to give your comment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan-Philipp, for your very thoughtful and well-structured paper in the Marxist tradition and somewhat beyond. And therefore, I found it particularly interesting that you continue to a certain degree the socialist calculation debate of Hayek and Mises, which started after the war, and also continues the tradition of computer socialism. As you know, socialism in real terms in the Soviet Union and many other countries was ruined, and surprisingly, in the early 1990s, a revival of this debate took place, started by your familiar Dr. Father Paul Cockshott and Ellen Cottrell with their book Towards a New Socialism, they published in 1993. I think you are working in this tradition, and it is really much progress and new insights in the theory and practice of socialism since the very first steps of enlightenment, utopian socialists and the basic ideas of Marx and Engels, establishing basic insights into the structure of future societies. You have just reminded us in your presentation. But of course, these are just necessary conditions for socialism or communism and not sufficient conditions. And therefore, you are working hard on developing further models. With respect to mathematical models and simulation, Marx was influenced by Quesnay's tableau économique. He was the first who formalized successfully the basic structure of a capitalist economy. And the Marxian schemes on simple and extended reproduction, Engels has described in the second volume of Capital, laid the foundation for all their successors up to now. And more, probably each scholars refer to Marx's writings negatively or positively when she speaks about socialism and communism. By the way, and this refers to an Austrian writer, one of the most elaborated critics to Marx and Engels' concepts of socialism in Austria has been Joseph Popper-Linkers, and he already in 1912 published the book Die allgemeine Nährpflicht als Lösung der sozialen Frage. And he offered, and this is a different strand than mathematics, he offered a basic income in kind based on the statistics of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, and he really analyzed these empire statistics in detail. Although it is somewhat outdated, because, for instance, he proposed the use of uranium, not for bombs, but for lightning of cars. I recommend it to read it because he offered a full perspective on more than 800 pages of a society in the future. But this was just the beginning. There was more to come. To remember you, already in 1893, exactly 100 years before Cockshott and Cottrell published their book, Lenin developed the first mathematical model of a dynamic economy with technical change. Later on, you see it on the screen. There is also, I took a joke and said, where Lenin really made a mistake because he was mistaken in the figures he wrote in his scheme. I recalculated on the computer. So later on, Gosplan used the material balances and already first steps of linear programming linked to Leonid Kantorovich. By means of his input-output analysis, Wassily Leontiev introduced planning models to the West. His first paper was published in 1936, after he was already honored by the Nobel Prize, and I had the opportunity to visit him at New York University. Unfortunately, he complained that he had problems to find enough money for his research projects. After the Second World War, various economic planning systems were implemented in all the socialist states of the world. In Hungary, I remind you, in the 1960s.
Sorry, Peter, du hast das Papier vor der Kamera.
In Hungary, in the 1960s, Korne and Litvak tried to modernize the planning system by a multi-level and regional planning. Later on, in the GDR textbooks for economic planning included also input-output models. I just mentioned Eva Müller, Manfred Oelfling, Hans Knoop, and Mr. Kosiolek, the head of the Institute of Socialist Economic Management. But as far as I know, they were never implemented into practice. Also in the in South America, there were interesting planning projects. I just mentioned Cuba under Fidel Castro, 1959, and the already mentioned Cybersyn project under Stafford Beer and Fernando Flores under Allende's government. They gave a presentation of their project at IASA, Luxembourg, near Vienna, and this was really very interesting. The promising project, as you know, couldn't be completed. Pinochet killed it in 1973. And it was in the year 1993, 100 years after Lenin, when Konrad Zuse, who built the first electronic computer of the world, coined the term computer socialism. Arno Peters mentions this in his book of the same title, also in the same year, when Towards a New Socialism by Cockshott and Cottrell was published. In their discussion, they thought about the main features of socialism based on economic planning, assisted by the computer. Many of the questions I will ask here were also mentioned and discussed there. And we shouldn't forget the book by my friend Heinz Dieterich on the socialism of the 21st century, where he used Cockshott's and Cottrell's expertise. Later on, he tried to convince Hugo Chavez to implement his concept of socialist planning, but as far as I know, without success. I remember him at the workshop of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin, where he presented his concepts maybe in 2010. Heinz's ideas were heavily rejected by Michael Bree, who had just published the book Pathways Towards Socialism in the 21st Century. Against Heinz, Michael defended the market, interestingly enough, as a very important achievement of civilization and the driver of innovation, and therefore as a necessary condition for any economy of the future. Now I come back to my questions to your presentation. While I can agree to all your statements on the difference of tokens and money and modern monetary theory, this is no problem with it. And also on the needs principle, where I agree completely with you that it is a question of, it's a dialectic question, how far the society has developed its resources and technology, and as it is written in Marx' Grundrisse, where you can see that then, even at this stage, it is possible to have a superfluous and communistic society. So I agree with all what you have mentioned. I have some questions on your chapter on token pricing. First, I assume that the playground on this chapter is early socialism or communism. And then you refer to requirements like land, natural resources, and raw materials. But I think that Marx has shown that the value of machinery can be completely described in labor time by live labor and the labor content of intermediary products. The other inputs, in addition to money, under capitalistic rule, are very valuable opportunities for profits. Are they still existing under socialism? Aren't they already transformed into commons? This refers also to the question of coercion by nature, like Robinson has seen. But here we know a quote by a philosopher, a German philosopher, Freiheit ist Einsicht in die Notwendigkeit. So maybe this is not really a very difficult problem to handle. Next, what type of model do you have in mind? Should it be a theoretical model to describe in principle how tokens could be priced? Or should it be a proposal for a prototype model to be used in an existing country? On what level of aggregation would you construct your model? Next, what is the methodology on which you would like to construct a socialist planning model. Is it agent-based modeling, or I think it is more linear programming? And probably the model will be dynamic, like Kantorowicz, Bellman, or by Pontryaghin's maximum principle. These are methods to determine the best pathway for the future. What are the variables in the goal function to minimize or maximize? And what are the constraints, which are really very, very important for environmental issues? And then one of the main questions, by what method you will determine the value of a token if you no longer will refer to labor cost? What is the unit on which a token is measured? How do you find the value related to clearing rates as a result of the intersection of supply and demand if you don't have any price system any longer? Will in this case really functions of this type exist? Or is it already outdated? If your model should be implemented in an actual country or region, how will you find the necessary data? I'm not familiar with the amount of information you need to end up at the Pareto optimal distribution on the complete population of a country. And how will you take into account the opportunity costs of a product, in particular if they refer to the subjective and individual level? Could you please elaborate on these issues? And then I would like to continue the socialist calculation debate. I think Paul Cockshott has already shown in 2006 that there is enough computer power available. In the meantime, the computer speed increased by the factor of 1,000, and maybe the problem will not be longer to solve large-scale dynamic systems under constraints. The problem will be how to manage all the input data. But also here, I'm optimistic. Like you mentioned, the British National Health System as a role model to compensate for the shortcomings of a socialist society, I would like to offer the multinational enterprise Walmart. There was a very interesting book recently which describes that although Walmart is still working under capitalist conditions, it is able to handle a large amount of data, and very successfully so, while for instance Sears used market mechanisms and lost heavily. Next one, how many variables you will have to handle? Do you think it is possible to find enough computer power to solve your model? So maybe I think it is no longer any calculation problem, but do you agree? Finally, I come to the end. I will ask a few political questions. First, how to handle differences in the level of complexity of work or of other differences between working people. I would like to mention an interesting idea by the Nobel laureate Jan-Philipp on wages. They should depend on the distance between a vector of the description of the job and the description of the personal abilities. If both vectors coincide, then there is a minimum remuneration. At a higher distance, the remuneration will become higher. Next, and I think this is also the goal of the workshop, how democratic can a planning process be if it is done by computer? Where are the interfaces to real people? And I think we have to exploit the dialectics of top-down and bottom-up planning. And then a very important question, what is your proposal of the institutional setup where participatory planning can truly be done? And the most burning question of all, of course, how can we organize the transition process to socialism? So my time is over, and therefore I stop here. But I would like to recommend you a recent book published in Austria, originally published in the year 1893 when Lenin's publication on the dynamic computer model was also printed and published. And it is a very funny book of Austria as a communist society 120 years after, where they keep up having an emperor, but the emperor now gives big Heurige for the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your very elaborate comment and also the many questions you raised. I would anyway start now the discussion first with quoting one question that we received in the chat. Many questions have been related in one or the other way to the question of motivation for production, or what is produced and what is the quality, so how to ensure the quality, and emphasizing that not inequality, but the contradiction between use and exchange value has been at the heart of the socialist problem, or problems in socialism. In that context, but maybe not immediately related, Anitra Nelson asks, you note that there is no question of distribution of the means of production because they become subjects, objects of commons. However, the ways we produce raises key questions in terms of how people want to work, and we need to respect the limits of nature. In turn, the decisions made on these questions do impact on the quality and quantity of the means of production. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So I'll try to sort of answer perhaps some of these questions and some of Peter's question. I don't think I'll be able to answer all of them, but I'll sort of answer them in general. I've of course only presented so far sort of my approach to the distribution of consumer goods, but maybe I'll say a bit about how production is planned and how that how what I said about distribution of goods then relates to that. So in my model as a whole, production is planned with a linear optimization. So this is precisely in the tradition of Leonid Kantorovich. And what Kantorovich showed is that you can have not only solve linear optimization problems, which he was the first one to show that can be done, but that you can also have a non-monetary objective function. So what is being maximized is the production of physical goods at set proportions. And in my model, you only consider the production of consumer goods. So you have set proportions. So for example, 4 chairs for every table, or 10 apples for every 5 oranges. Yeah. So you have set proportions in which consumer products are produced. And then you produce as much as possible, and you calculate an optimized plan for that. And I consider this to be a kind of in-kind planning, right? Because you do not have valuation, and you do not need to value the means of production at all. Productive resources don't need to be valued in my model. I'm working on sort of an adjustment where this might be the case, but currently that is not the case. And it seems, of course, bogus to sort of just have fixed proportions at which consumer products are produced. So what I then do is I adjust these proportions based on consumer feedback. And what's being used here is precisely the market clearing prices, which result from sort of consumer behavior. And these are then used as indicators whether we should produce more of one product type or less of a product type. If the prices are high, it means we should produce more of it. If the prices are low, it means we should produce less of it. How are these clearing prices realized? So you do not need a computer for this. You don't need a computer to directly determine the clearing prices. Instead, you simply adjust the prices in a trial and error process. So if you observe that demand is higher than supply, then you have to raise the price. If it's lower than supply, you lower the price. This could in principle be done by wholesale managers or something like this. You can also, of course, computerize this with sort of a computerized control function. But that is not a particularly complex mathematical problem. What is a bit more complex is the optimization of production. Luckily for this, as Peter suggested, it seems that today this is solvable. Paul Cockshott has actually devised sort of a new method of optimization. He already used this in the 1990s, but he sort of refined it a bit recently. And he says with this method, you could plan an economy with sort of, I think it's 500 million different product types within 22 minutes on a modern supercomputer. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. In my model, however, you need to do more than one of these optimizations. You actually need to do one for every consumer product. So at that point, it does get problematic. So this is still something you need to keep in mind and refine it somewhat. So I think this also perhaps answers the question by Peter, whether this is just a theoretical model or a practical proposal. I want it to be a practical proposal, but there are still some work that needs to be done so that it can actually be implemented. So you do need to solve this problem of limiting the number of optimizations. And there are also other limitations. For example, my current model doesn't allow for economic growth. It assumes a more or less static economy. And so there's still work to be done until this sort of can be practically applied. Okay, I've tried to answer as much as possible, but I don't think most possible now. But I'll look forward to more questions.
Thank you. There have been two more questions, which are, I think, somewhat related again. At least the first one by Clara Bonk, and I think it would be interesting to hear a comment on that. She's more explicitly, what type of labor would be counted towards those labor tokens? So if you talk about consumer goods, when we think of apples, we could also think of childcare. So she goes on, especially asking about reproductive work like childcare, because if that work wasn't counted towards labor token, this would lead to a lot of inequality. That is one question. Then another question by Colleen Schneider. How do you make sure that there doesn't emerge something like a secondary market? So in the sense that the tokens are just traded on a secondary market. And after that, I open the floor for project participants. Please just raise your hand so I can nominate you. We will go until Q2, so Q1 time-wise, and then we do a 1 hour break.
Okay, so first, what kind of labor would tokens be rewarded for? And there are, of course, proposals, and I mean, this could perhaps in theory even be done with money, but it could certainly be done with these labor tokens. There are proposals to pay housework, right? And I'm entirely sympathetic to these kinds of proposals. Another way this can, however, be done, instead of sort of paying people for reproductive labor within their own homes, you can, of course, also socialize a lot of that labor. And to some extent, that is already being done. So when you have kindergartens, that is a way of socializing childcare. And of course, kindergartners are already paid and probably should be paid more or less a lot more than they are. I imagine that under socialism, perhaps you would go more in that direction. Maybe you'd also have more sort of people's canteens where food would be prepared and where people who work there, obviously that would be work that is recognized. So you can go more in this direction as well. The question of a secondary market. So I don't think there is much of a risk of this happening because production is socialized. So what would be traded on that secondary market? You could, of course, get something out of the social supply of goods with your tokens and then sell it or trade it to someone else. But they might as well just get it directly out of socialized production. So there's no real need for that. There could be a secondary market for second-hand items, right? And I think that's actually a good thing. And that's something to be encouraged because you don't want these things to go to waste. So I don't see a problem there. But the main thing, I think, is that production has to be socialized. And when that is the case, socialized production is the only originator of commodities, or not commodities anymore. It's not commodity production, but goods. So there's no real purpose to a secondary market.
Thank you. There is a question by Elena Hofferberth.
Yes, hi. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm sorry, maybe I'm too utilitarian in my approach, but I think it's super important to go through things like theoretically and think of things in the abstract of what is possible. At the same time, I do think it's also important to see like how do these debates connect to the real world challenges? And I'm just wondering if you in your model see kind of connections to some approaches in real world politics, or not necessarily like politics widely understood in like debates on how to tackle climate change inequality, or like which fora or movements or like real world examples where you think there could be connections to what you have been thinking about, or where you would like to see connections.
Okay. So my proposal is, of course, in the socialist tradition, and there's a long tradition of the socialist movement, and sort of the principal requirement also, I think this leads to the question of transition, which Peter also raised. The principal requirement to realize this would be socialization of the means of production, right? So you need socialized production. And of course, as long as you don't have that, might be more difficult to realize these sorts of things. But to relate this also to a current problem, which you also raised, the environmental problem, and I think earlier people also asked about constraints and environmental constraints, is that in my model, you can, or in any linear programming model, you can limit the amounts of certain resources that can be used and that are being used. And I apply this not just to sort of resources being used, but also to emissions. So you can limit emissions, and I see this sort of in the tradition of a global carbon budget, the idea of a carbon budget. So you would limit the amount of emissions that are permissible, and then find an optimized production plan under this constraint that no more CO2 or greenhouse gases can be emitted than this budget allows for. So I think there are a lot of there's a lot of relevancy to current problems. Yeah.
Thank you. Then there is a question by Manuel Scholz-Weckele.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I follow up a question from Peter with a bit more detail. I'm a bit skeptical about the aggregated approach you take, in particular when it comes to clearing rates and clearing prices. I think you underestimate the dynamics of complex adaptive systems. So it's not that you may miscalculate the clearing rate or the clearing price, but with handing out or signing out a clearing price, you create expectations, and you basically pull the society after you. This is something that may lead to mismatches, not abruptly, but over time, accumulating mismatches, maladaptations in the system, and to cascades, basically, that you can't endogenize with an aggregate perspective, even if you calculate it close to optimal situation. As you said, it must be a try and error process. Linear programming is also an iterative thing. So it's about discrete choices, and the adjustments, I'm super skeptical about that, because you basically let the society learn after the algorithm you implement. So the algorithm becomes the cast here, and not the society. It's just a comment.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure why you think sort of these mismatches might accumulate. But perhaps, I mean, this relates also to this question of sort of democracy and democratic institutions in which this can be implemented. Perhaps the plan which is yielded through my algorithm, right, and adapted in response to consumer demand and these clearing prices and so on, perhaps this should not be seen as a unconditional obligation that society has to follow, right? So perhaps this should be seen more as an advisory mechanism, which then sort of the collective planning, democratic planning of society can abide by, but can also be aware of limitations that might have and adapt the plan accordingly. So that is entirely possible. But as I said, I'm not entirely sure what mismatches you think will occur here. But maybe we can.
I'm just saying that you create expectations basically, and these expectations are basically new models that people build, not on behalf of societal mediation, but on behalf of the mediation via the calculated clearing price. So the future is perceived, is changed through that clearing price. The signal basically pulls society in a specific direction.
Yes.
Via expectations.
That is certainly true, because the plan is adapted in response to consumer demand as signaled by clearing prices. So that's definitely true, but that's I would call it an intended feature rather than a problem. So I'm not sure where you see the problem, but maybe we can discuss this detailed later.
Thank you. Then there is a question by Ruth Levita.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to what you said about all production being socialized. I mean, besides the vexed question of what constitutes production, I wonder if that is possible. And what was in my mind is, well, what do you do about individual artistic and craft production? Would those tend to create a market of their own? Are there things that actually necessarily lie outside of socialized production?
Okay, that's a good question. So I think there are two ways to answer that. And the first is simply, well, yes, the creation of art, music, and so on is just as important and satisfies, I think, a very important human need. And so why shouldn't it be recognized just as any other work, right? So there could be positions or paid work paid in terms of tokens for this kind of work, just like there is for any other. And the second is, of course, that this could also, in addition to that, perhaps be also something that people do in their free time, and hopefully people would have more free time to pursue these kinds of activities, which can also be an end in itself, right? So it's not just that the artist creates something which others enjoy, but the process of creating art might also be enjoyable in itself. Right? So I would hope that by having workers, by workers being less exploited, they would also have more time, or any worker would also have more time to pursue these kinds of things. There's then, of course, the question, if we say some creative processes are going to be sort of rewarded by tokens and others are not, and more seen as sort of a private hobby, there has, of course, to be some mechanism for deciding who gets paid for their art and who doesn't, or who receives tokens for their arts and who doesn't. And I have some ideas on how that could be done. You could have, of course, sort of what already exists to some extent, like arts council who decide on arts funding. But you could also, I think, sort of democratize that in a sense by having what I call institutionalized crowdfunding. So you could also have, say, maybe part of the common funds shouldn't be sort of hierarchically allocated by an arts council. Maybe some of that will be directly distributed by the people who maybe each have sort of a certain share of that they can allocate towards artists or musicians. But whatever they create then should of course be freely available to everyone. Certainly in the case of digital products, digital music, for example, which can be downloaded for free.
Thank you. There is 3 more questions, so I would like to collect them and ask all these 3, Peter, Simon and Stefan, to say only like a question in terms of like 1 sentence, and then Philip can wrap up within the next 5 minutes or so. So Stefan, then Peter, and then Simon.
Okay, my question is, do tokens represent coerced activity? Because it follows the rule, who's not working should not eat. My second question is, you cannot socialize or reproduction activities. So there is a valued sphere of production and a non-so-valued sphere of reproduction. And don't this reproduce the split off of these 2 spheres?
Peter?
Yeah, I just want to mention that by the development of technologies, probably means of production are more and more individually owned. So if you have the fabricator and you have a 3D printer, and even if you have a computer on your own, you have means of production where you can do either alone or with a group. You could do socialized production also.
Thank you. Simon?
I still have the question, how does your model solve the problems of real socialism that I don't find only in bad planning or people didn't get equal stuff, because they did get things quite equal. They all stood in line to get it. But because enterprise and people were first forced to do stuff to obtain a living, they tried to hide their production capacities, didn't increase productivity, didn't produce in line with the contracts, produced bad qualities. And I think that's all true to your model. I think that's the same problem, I'd say.
Okay, so are tokens still coercive? I guess so. If you have to work to get them, obviously people who cannot work under Marx already receive provisions, and I would suggest provisions in terms of tokens that they can use to get whatever they want. But for those who are able to work, I guess so that there's an coercive element to this. But that's why I also earlier asked for your talk whether sort of coercion out of necessity is not also coercion. I think it is. And society and society as a whole certainly has this coercion by necessity, right? So we have to produce certain things in order for these things to be available to satisfy some need. And society will have to come up with some way of then allocating labor to do that, to satisfy those needs, to produce the things that we need. Right? And of course, you could do that through coercion by sort of just forcing people to do certain things, which I think is compatible with the higher stage of communism by Marx, when he says, well, each will contribute according to their abilities. That seems to me to be compatible with just directly saying, well, you can do that, so you have to do that. I think in a way it is less coercive if you give people the option to choose how much are they going to work and make the trade-off themselves with how much will be produced that they can take out of socialized production. So in a sense, I think it gives people more freedom to freely decide what their level of work and consumption is going to be. There could still be limits to that, to do with environmental constraints, for example, because we don't, we might, it might not be environmentally sustainable for people to produce too much. Let me then also address the problems of real socialism. So some of the problem that Simon mentioned, my model doesn't address. I think they can be addressed, but it's not something I specifically deal with in my model, such as individual factories not being transparent about their productive capacities and so on. Other problems certainly are solved. So one of the problems in real socialism was that they had a balanced plan where the inputs of one industry might have matched the outputs of other industries. So the steel input of the car industry might have matched, output of the steel industry. They didn't. The plan didn't dictate to use more steel than was available. But it wasn't an optimized production plan. So you could have had a feasible production plan which produced more. And while Kantorowicz developed this method of optimal planning, it was only used in a very limited way in the Soviet Union. The other problem that Simon mentioned is people waiting in line in supermarkets. Everyone was equal because they waited in line. Well, I did mention this in my talk. If you don't have market clearing prices, then you're going to get that. And in the real socialism, often they didn't use labor pricing, but they did have artificially low prices for a lot of consumer products. And that meant that more people wanted to buy these things. It didn't necessarily mean that there was less available. Paul Cockshott actually looked at meat consumption, compared it from Poland and Scotland, and found that there was more meat being consumed in Poland than in Scotland. But when you went into the supermarket in Poland, there was no meat because it was always immediately bought because the price was so low. But when you have clearing prices, the price will automatically increase, and you don't have to wait in line to be one of a few lucky people, or one of the lucky people who gets to buy meat. Instead, the tokens will actually be decisive of who gets what.